Thank you very much. I had a presentation. Let me take this opportunity to thank Monsignor Sorondo, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, Honorable Susanna Medina, and the International Association of Women Judges, as well as everyone else who has participated in successfully organizing this summit. I thank you for the opportunity to present Uganda's perspective on this human trafficking phenomenon. Let me take the opportunity to introduce Uganda to you. Uganda is an East African country. It's known as the Pearl of Africa. It's a beautiful country with beautiful, friendly people, beautiful weather, good agricultural climate, plenty of food, fruits, beautiful lakes, the source of the second longest river in the world, River Nile, and diverse flora, fauna, and wildlife. That is beautiful Uganda. So you're welcome to visit my country anytime. But Uganda is also known as having the world's youngest population, with over 78% of its population below the age of 30 years. And because of that, it has one of the highest levels of unemployment, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa. This youth unemployment rate in Uganda has been estimated to stand at around 64 to 78%, with an average of over or about 400,000 youths being released annually into the job market to compete for approximately 9,000 jobs. So you can see how dire the situation is. As a result, we have so many educated people, youth, without jobs. This has made many of them very desperate. And that takes me to who the victim of trafficking in Uganda is. The victim of trafficking is usually a vulnerable, desperate person. Desperate because of poverty, desperate because some are illiterate, they are homeless, they are unemployed. That is the victim we are talking about. And it's because they are in this desperate situation that many of them have ended up in the hands of these unscrupulous people who pretend to be lending out a hand of help to them, to help them get jobs, and in the end they end up exploiting them. Majority of our cases in human trafficking involve transnational human trafficking, and majority are women who are taken for domestic work. The concerns about domestic exploitation of domestic workers was raised in 2009, and it was reported that about 148 girls were taken to Iraq. They subsequently lodged a complaint with the Ministry of Gender, citing, among others, denial of wages, gang rape, long working hours, torture at the hands of their employers. As a result, in 2016, from 2009, nothing was done. It's in January 2016 that the Parliament of Uganda banned labor exploitation to the Middle East, following that public outcry. And the intention was to create the necessary checks and balances that would ensure that cases of human trafficking and migrant exploitation are reduced. Unfortunately, because we have this whole population of youth that are employed, many of whom were going for this work, there was a public outcry. There were actually strikes and riots on the streets of Kampala because these youths were saying that the ban was an attempt by the government to keep them into a situation of abject poverty. And as a result, in May 2016, after barely 5 months after banning exploitation of labor to the Middle East, the ban was overturned. It was lifted. So the recruiters started taking our youths back to the Middle East. According to the report by the Uganda Parliamentary Committee on Labour and Gender, about 50 Ugandan migrant workers, of whom 32 were women, died in the Arab Emirates between 2006 and 2017. And about 35 of these deaths were ruled as suicides resulting from the dreadful working conditions and the fact that the travel documents of these victims had been confiscated, either by their employers or the recruiting firms. So the victims had nowhere to go, had nothing to do, they ended up committing suicide. However, it's unfortunate that despite these dire situations, many of our youth still risk going back to these countries. And as I say, they do so because of their unfortunate circumstances back home. As we are discussing with some colleagues over lunch, the reality of Africa, most of our African countries, is that people are very, very poor. People are very desperate. So they know, they're not totally ignorant about human trafficking. They know that it happens. And they've heard stories of colleagues, friends, relatives who have died as a result of human trafficking. But more often than not, they will go as a sacrifice for the family. One person will decide to go because maybe she's a single parent, maybe because the parents are very old, so they need to sacrifice themselves to get the opportunity of making the lives better for their families. So they still end up going back to these countries and being exploited. The legal framework, we are signatories to a number of conventions mentioned by other participants, but I'll go straight to our domestic law. We have the Prevention of Trafficking in Persons Act, 2009. It guides the management of the criminal investigations, protection of the victims of crime, preventive strategies against the crime, and partnership among the stakeholders at the national and transnational levels. However, given the dynamics of the crime in the country, some incidents related to trafficking in persons have also been handled under the regulations for labor recruitment and export of migrant workers and under the Penal Code Act. The definition of trafficking in person is no different from other countries. So I'll not belabor the point. But according to our law, the punishment ranges from 7 years to death. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on who you're talking to, Uganda has maintained the death penalty. But for trafficking, it has been maintained for trafficking cases that involve children only. Aggravated trafficking of children is where the death penalty is maintained. And it's not mandatory. It's at the discretion of the court. That means that it's only in Uganda, the High Court only tries cases that are punishable by death. Life imprisonment and other sentences, imprisonment sentences are tried by magistrate courts. Magistrate courts are not courts of precedent. As my colleague from Malawi said, more often than not, these cases, when they go to the magistrate courts, they get lost under the radar. They are mishandled. So what we actually do is that even if the High Court is supposed to try cases that are punishable by a maximum sentence of death, the High Court is a court of original jurisdiction. So for the very sensitive cases, even if they can be tried by the magistrate courts, we commit them to High Court for trial, especially where we need precedent to be made. The victim of trafficking includes a person who is being or has been trafficked. Exploitation includes sexual exploitation, forced marriage, child marriage, forced labor, harmful child labor, use of a child in armed conflict, use of a person in illegal activities, debt bondage, slavery or practices similar to slavery or servitude, human sacrifice, the removal of organs or body parts for sale or for purposes of witchcraft, harmful rituals, and practices. Like my other colleagues have already submitted, organ trafficking initially in Uganda, we linked it to human sacrifice because the known cases were largely connected to human sacrifice, where children's private parts were removed. It was mostly private parts, the ears, the tongues, for ritual sacrifices. That's what we knew for a long time. And that's why we had to include that, because it's very, very prevalent in Uganda. Many of the trafficking cases involving children involve human sacrifice. But in due course, we have come to realize that organ harvesting is actually happening. Our newspapers are awash with stories where organ harvesting is very rife in Uganda. We hear of stories where accident victims in Uganda and other countries in East Africa, we have what we call border transport. That is motorcycle transportation. So there are so many accidents involving the motorcycle riders. Many of them are dumped in our hospitals. But we had stories where these barely conscious victims, most of them are really semi-literate, illiterate, very poor. So we had stories where these victims' organs were being harvested by unscrupulous doctors in our medical facilities. And then we also we've had stories of unsuspecting refugees, street children, or the homeless, who are taken off the streets and their organs harvested. Children in orphanages have been victims. So, and as a result of recent, we're in fact cautioned that even when you go for a medical procedure, for example, a cesarean operation, you had better first do a scan, body scan, to be sure that every part of you is intact. And then when you're done with the operation, go back for another scan at another independent hospital to make sure that everything is still intact. What does that show? Is that this thing is rife, it's happening. Unfortunately, there is not much data collected. The stories are in the papers, but when you try to look for the statistics, they are not much. Meaning, I know of two cases currently, where one, a businesswoman, convinced her shopkeeper to donate a kidney for the husband who was ailing. They promised him land, houses. He allowed. He was a very young man, very poor. Then when they went over to India, they carried out the operation. Unfortunately, the husband died, and the woman reneged on her promise. And it's because she refused to pay this boy that he reported the incident to police. And when they carried out the medical examination, they confirmed that his kidney had actually been removed. So we are prosecuting the lady for aggravated human trafficking. Another one involved an army officer who needed a kidney again. Most of the human trafficking, organ trafficking are in kidneys in Uganda. He enticed this young man with a promise of about $45,000 US. So the young man agreed. They went to India, and when they reached there, just before the operation could take place, he had second thoughts. So he said, no, I actually can't go through this. But according to his testimony, the next thing, after refusing to go through with the procedure, he woke up after the procedure had actually taken place. So he came back. When he came back, he reported the incident, and the army officer, as well as the doctor in India, actually were identified, and the case is in court. So those are the few of the cases we know. Many of them are going under the radar because we are not actually doing much to follow up about this organ trafficking. It's important to note that consent of victims of trafficking, for example, a child's consent or consent of his or her parents to the acts of exploitation, is immaterial in Uganda. Like other countries, Uganda is a source, transit, and destination country for trafficking in persons, including both transnational trafficking and domestic trafficking. As I said, there is limited data on the prevalence and prosecution of trafficking. I have some statistics indicating transnational victims go to Oman, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, among other countries. And then number of cases have increased over the years, but the number of convictions are still very, very low. The challenges are the same as other countries have indicated. There are extraterritorial challenges. We have challenges of charging where we more often than not prefer to charge under the Penal Code Act because majority of our prosecutors and investigators are not aware of the Trafficking in Persons Act. Interventions, awareness, sensitization, enhanced training, these are the same responses that other countries have raised. So I will only add my voice to other participants in requesting that if we want to address this phenomenon of human trafficking, we should bring on board our leaders, especially the heads of state. And the voice of His Holiness the Pope would be very key. If we had a meeting of the heads of state and they made it an agenda, then it would receive all the necessary resources that it needs. But if we don't do that, I don't know whether much will be done. We'll have the paperwork, we have the laws, but a lot more needs to be done. I thank you.